Jakarta, and hello everyone joining from other parts of the world. We hope your days has been well. Welcome to the X series of Global Town Hall on the US and European de-risking strategy. I am Lian, and I will be the master of ceremony for today's discussions. In addition to the annual flagship event, the Global Town Hall has now convened regular, smaller scale discussions intended to create a platform for conversations among the civil societies. The theme of these discussions will range from geopolitics, climate, food security, technology, and many more. So please do look forward to the upcoming Global Town Hall series. Today, I'm pleased to welcome over 255 registered participants registered to the discussions. We have attendees from more than 30 countries. To name some but not all, we have attendees from Turkey, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Kenya, and Portugal, and many more, making this an actual global town hall. And on today's discussions, we will look into the US and Europe de-risking strategy toward China. And we have the pleasure of welcoming Ambassador Ted Osius, President and CEO of the US-ASEAN Business Council. Welcome, Ambassador. And secondly, we have Dr. Alicia Garcia, Chief Economist for Asia Pacific at Natixis and also Senior Fellow at Bruegel. Welcome, Dr. Alicia. And last but not least, we have Xiaoshui Martin, Research Fellow at the Klingendale China Center. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in these discussions. And now, without further ado, allow me to hand over the discussions to our moderator, Shahril Sufian Hamdan, who is Managing Director at Watchtower Advisory and also host of Keluar Sekejap podcast. Shahril, you may have the screen.
Thank you, Lian. Thanks, FPCI, for this kind invite, and welcome everyone. I understand there are a couple hundred people tuning in from across different countries to watch what we all hope will be an extremely enlightening session, speaking about a topic that is quite topical with everything that's going around in the world, as well as in particular in our region in Southeast Asia. We have three distinguished speakers that's already been introduced by Lian. Maybe just to get the ball rolling, what I'd like to start our discussion with, the topic today is really about de-risking. And I didn't want to take for granted that we all understood the same thing when we speak about de-risking. So maybe if I could just get each of the three speakers to give their point of view about two things. What does de-risking look like in their point of view? And what is the end point of this de-risking? What is the rationale and what is the end point of why we do deglobalization or even de-risking? Perhaps Ambassador Osius, something you want to begin with? I think you're on mute, Ambassador.
Thank you. That happens in every meeting at one point or another. Thank you, Shahril. So de-risking means that there's an element of national security considerations that enter into the process of global trade. So when a country seeks to de-risk, they're trying to manage supply chain vulnerabilities, safeguard national security, but still maintain economic ties. Very often, de-risking focuses on the diversification of supply chains, on ensuring access, for example, to critical minerals and critical technologies, and to strengthen economic ties with friendly countries. It's not the same as decoupling. The end state is not the separation, but a reduction in depending on a country that might not be friendly to your interests. So I'm in Singapore right now. I just met with a very senior Singapore leader who noted that, Southeast Asia, this is an area where I work, Southeast Asia benefits from bifurcation and de-risking. It's one of the regions in the world where you can take advantage of the relative strengths of the countries in this region to see where the benefits are from the fact that countries like the United States and the nations of EU have embarked on a de-risking strategy. It's not, and one other thing that de-risking is not, it's not the same as protectionism. It's not so much inward looking as it is concerned with strengthening economic ties to trusted nations, and strengthening supply chains.
Very good. Perhaps I could direct a similar question to Dr. Alicia, but also tag on an added one, which is, Dr. Alicia, what do you feel about what Ambassador Osius just said about how it's not, de-risking is really diversifying, it's about resilience, but what is the impact of all of these things, despite Ambassador saying it's not the same as protectionism? What is the impact that you see happening when de-risking becomes a theme to overall global growth?
Well, first of all, I think de-risking is indeed, I quite agree, it doesn't have to be protectionism. In the European context, we generally associate de-risking to diversifying the sources of inputs, so imports as well, and of course exports. So the idea is that you can't be extremely reliable on a single source. And that doesn't have to be necessarily China, it could be any source. Just imagine gas from Russia in the light of the war in Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine for that matter. So that's another type of dependence that de-risking tries to avoid. Of course, any economic relation where you depend 100% on a single source is a source of risk, let alone if the country where you're importing from or exporting to is not aligned with you in a number of principles. So in other words, the risking comes to the forefront, the more so, the least the countries are aligned. So in other words, gas for Russia was supposedly not a big problem before the war. It becomes a big problem after the war. So you can call that protectionism. For me, it's actually good economic management, because you're not supposed to be excessively dependent on a single source, less so if you don't follow the same principles. It's very, very simple. That concept of de-risking, though, has an additional angle, which I think the US is more focused on. And increasingly Europe, although it was not the origin of the concept, but with our new economic security strategy, it has come as a second order of importance beyond diversification, which is obviously a risk to national security. And I just want to end by saying that I fully agree with the ambassador that Southeast Asia is to profit from this idea of de-risking. And here's the thing, not only because of European or American de-risking, also because of Chinese de-risking. Because at the end of the day, China's, to me, is the very first nation who's started to de-risk many years ago to engage in self-reliance. But increasingly, because of the American and European de-risking, finding Southeast Asia as a way to reduce the impact of de-risking on China, i.e. basically investing in Southeast Asia, manufacturing in Southeast Asia, selling to the US or Europe. So in that regard, I think because of these two sources of consequences of de-risking, I think Southeast Asia is clearly a winner.
Thank you for that, Dr. Alicia. I think we can attest even in Malaysia, but I'm sure Indonesia, other countries in Southeast Asia, Vietnam as well, has been a witness of exactly what you said, Dr. Alicia, in terms of Chinese companies or Chinese-based companies now sort of reshoring, if you can use that term, into Southeast Asian countries to almost bypass the kinds of sanctions and barriers that they now face. I think we'll come back to Southeast Asia a little bit later in our discussion. I wanted to bring in Xiao Se, Ms. Martin, to speak a bit more about the Europe angle, because the topic today is the US and Europe strategy to de-risk. I would assume that there might be some differences between the two. Maybe share with us, Ms. Martin, what you feel is the EU position that might be distinct from the American one.
Yes, thank you for the invitation to such a wonderful panel. I'm based here in the Netherlands, so I speak a lot with the European policymakers, but also with Chinese policymakers, and we really see the differences there. The big mantra on de-risking is not decoupling, and that's something we have to repeat every time, because in China it's often seen differently. As you can imagine, de-risking is even defined within the European in different ways in different member states. So we ourselves first have to put a lot of effort in making sure that everybody understands it in the same way in the EU. As Dr. Alicia Garcia already mentioned, there's also a little bit of difference between how the EU sees it and how the US sees it, with the US focusing a little bit more on the national security aspect. How the EU likes to look at policy is a lot through the framework of the 3 Ps, with 3 Ps for protect, promote, and partner, and aligning different policies along those 3 Ps. For de-risking, what we see so far in the measures that have been taken so far, they focus quite a lot on the protect pillar. So you can think about measures like foreign direct investment screening, or export regulations. That doesn't mean it's protectionism, but it's more focused on the protect side. What the EU should focus on a little bit more is on the partner and on the promote side. Partner as in partnering with other countries, like countries in ASEAN, to make sure that we manage and mitigate the risks better. And promote, meaning that we have to promote our own industries more as well. It's easy to say, of course, oh, we don't want to be dependent on this in this country for resources or for products, but that means we have to invest in our own economies to build that up as well. We also asked, what's the end point of de-risking? And that's another thing that the EU has to work on, is in defining where exactly are the red lines for us. What is the endpoint of de-risking? Very broadly, for us, the endpoint is open strategic autonomy, meaning that we can act without having to be dependent on other countries. We don't have to fear, for example, retaliation by China if we want to do X or Y. But that's still quite a broad view. China is much better in defining where exactly its red lines are, and we in the EU have to do that better.
Thanks everyone for that first round of responses. I want to kind of kick it up one gear, be ever so slightly provocative, Ambassador Osius, and maybe bring in a normative element, because I think there's 2 ways to go about this. We can be academic and sort of technocratic about what de-risking is, how we achieve it. But I think the backdrop to this, that there is a normative judgment that's being made when speaking about de-risking. And if I can suggest, the view of folks in Southeast Asia, sort of non-aligned or multi-aligned countries like Malaysia, there is a sense of, if I can use the word, hypocrisy. Because the West, loosely defined as EU and the US, for the longest of time, at least in my adult lifetime, has been speaking about globalization, free trade, the sense that we should push down barriers rather than build new ones. How would you respond to the charge that de-risking is really just one way of the West responding to a China and to an East that is becoming more and more prominent and less to do with any economic logic?
Well, first I would go back to what Dr. Alicia Garcia said, that it's also good economic management. And I work with 182 companies, mostly American-based companies, that are very active in the region. And they're making economic decisions, not based on politics, not based on what Washington or Brussels are telling them to do, but based on good economic management. You want to diversify your supply chains. You want to diversify your markets. And a lot of companies learned during COVID, this wasn't about politics, this was about the reaction of governments in the region, and whether they allowed them to do their business even during a difficult time, the difficult time of COVID. And they found that some governments didn't. Some governments made it very hard to do business in this region and weren't interested in the concerns of companies that are based in the region, investing heavily in the region, but said, you play by our rules or you walk. And some of them said, okay, well, then we're going to diversify. We're going to diversify our markets. We're going to diversify our supply chains. I agree with you that there's been a sense over the last decades that the overall rules set by the West were, let's bring down barriers, let's open markets, let's find opportunities for free trade to flow. But the truth is, in democratic nations, we found that not everyone has benefited from globalization. So there's been a pressure from electorates in Europe, in the United States, and elsewhere to make sure that we're also growing fairly, trading fairly, and treating people equally at home, because the benefits of globalization haven't been equal. So in the United States, where I live, there have been efforts to boost research on semiconductor production. So not all of that activity will take place overseas. Yeah, their politics has entered into it, but it's the politics of a democratic society that's reacting to problems within that society, as well as the problems of trade. And there's been a lot of discussion between the United States and Europe about how we can deal with those democratic pressures and still grow our economies, still find ways to make an energy transition towards more climate-friendly technologies in energy and in transportation, and how we can do that together, how we can depend on one another so that we're not always dependent on the whims of countries that aren't friendly to us.
Thank you, Ambassador. Dr. Alicia Garcia Herrero, maybe just bring you in on a similar train of thought. Your response that this is principally a political economy question. I think the ambassador very eloquently put the position that there was also a clear commercial rationale, but one cannot escape the reality that with the what Congress has passed, with the rhetoric that's in DC, there is clearly a political angle for why this is even happening to begin with. How would you respond to that? And how would we, in, say, the developing world in Southeast Asia, think through these things in a way that would benefit us as well?
Well, the case of the US is, I would say, slightly different from Europe. The US has indeed set up a huge apparatus, IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, which does, in a way, enhance, I would say, I would use the word enhance economic rationality. I would not deny the economic rationality, because especially since COVID, but also after the war in Ukraine, companies are fully aware that decisions that may look reasonable because they're efficient, lower cost, etc., become very expensive after a while. But yes, there is some political economy angle. IRA is an example. But I would have to say that that's true on the other side of the equation. So let me explain what I mean. China uses industrial policy to attract companies like Tesla, like Volkswagen, basically in the very same way as the US has done more recently with IRA. So, in other words, can we argue that China's attracting such a huge share of global FDI for years, not anymore, by the way, is only a reflection of economic rationale? Can we argue that? Maybe not. So there's never, to answer your question, anything that is only economic rationale. Economic rationale is mixed with policies, economic policies, sometimes political economy. I mean, this is not new. We've not invented this with de-risking or decoupling. It's always existed. So I would not put excessive weight on that. I would not argue, I think it would be wrong to argue that companies leave China just because, the US forces them to do so, or European institutions force them to do so, because that would not explain the amount of foreign direct investment that has left the mainland since basically 2021. 2022 starts this process of de-investment, basically. And the process is very simple. Foreign companies decide either not to invest in the mainland if they've never been there, so there's no newcomers, but most importantly, those who are there prefer to repatriate profits rather than reinvest those profits. That's basically what's happening. There's no company that says, there you go, I've invested billions, I'm leaving. That is not happening because the sunk cost is huge. But, you know, if you have a new dollar from China and you can invest it in Malaysia, you may as well do so. So is that explained by politics only? No, it's explained by the return on investment, which is increasingly low in China. So there's three things here. Excessive concentration of risk, politics, I don't deny it, but also the pure reality that the Chinese market is growing well below ASEAN, well below, and the return on assets is well below ASEAN. So investors just prefer to go elsewhere. So I would not highlight too much the politics of it. I know it sounds very important, but I think companies know better. You know, they just take their decisions.
Thank you. Ms. Martin, maybe bring you back into this discussion. I realize that we're speaking a lot from the view of EU and the US, but maybe it's time for us to start thinking whether it's even possible to achieve the kind of outcomes that is linked to de-risking and diversification of supply chains, in the sense that if the political question here, and I'll try and make sure we don't belabor this point too much, but if the political question here is about containing China, I wonder, Ms. Martin, if you have a view about whether that's even possible. We see data, for example, that manufacturing exports from China is still growing, albeit through a different route. So on the political question, Ms. Martin, do you think it's something that is achievable if containment is the end goal?
Thank you. Yeah, let me just restate again that containment isn't really the end goal for the EU, at least in de-risking. It's more in managing the risks that there are in the relationship with China, but also with other countries. And one of the important pillars of de-risking that the Commissioner von der Leyen also announced in 2023, when she announced the term de-risking, is that de-risking through diplomacy remains one of the important things. So remaining to engage diplomatically, but also, of course, people-to-people ties and engaging in other ways. While containing isn't the end goal of de-risking. That said, of course, there is interests and benefits in managing more strategic sectors within Europe. I live in the Netherlands. We have a very clear case that's in the media a lot as well, which is the semiconductor sector with ASML. And the reasoning for the Netherlands to limit or restrict the export of some of the most advanced machines to China for chip making is protecting our own economic competition position, but also national security, in that it might actually be a security risk to export chip machines of that caliber to China. Which doesn't mean we want to contain China, but it means we want to look after our own national security. And I think it's really important to underline that containment of China isn't the goal in the EU. This is a frame that's often used by the Chinese side, the official Chinese side, to criticize the idea of de-risking. And as Dr. Alicia Garcia already said, China is actually one of the first countries to de-risk. Not a name maybe, but definitely in policies. So China has actually been really smart in protecting its strategic industries, making lists, for example, of the things where they want to focus their economy on and what they do and do not want to export. And we in Europe are catching up on that. We should have started de-risking years ago. We started de-risking, of course, before 2023 under different names, but still we have been a little bit naive in how we relate to China, but also to Russia, for example, with the energy dependence.
Shahrial, can I jump in and add?
Sure.
Not so much in disagreement, but actually really more in strong agreement with both Alicia and Xiaoshui. the story is also one of growth. If you're a company that's very much involved in China, you're not going to pull out and leave those investments in China. But where is global growth being driven from? For about 30 years, global growth was driven by China. I would say today, and perhaps for the next 30 years, global growth is driven by Southeast Asia and India. Right now, Southeast Asia is growing over 6%, and some of the countries in Southeast Asia are growing 7.5%. India is growing very fast. So these are decisions that I think are also driven by where are the growth opportunities. That makes them, they may involve national security, but they very much also involve rational business decision-making.
Clear. I wish we had a Chinese perspective on the panel, but very clear where everyone here feels about the rationale, the very strong economic rationale as you see it of de-risking. But we've spoken for a few minutes now about Southeast Asia. I think some of the responses have referred to the region correctly as a growth region. Maybe Ambassador Eustace can come back to you. You know, one of the things that we hear alongside de-risking is the mantra of friendshoring.
Mm-hmm.
And this would be particularly relevant to the United States, I imagine. The follow-on question to that term, friendshoring, is who is on top of the list of the friendshore list. I'm speaking from Malaysia, and when there was a CHIPS agreement between the US and Vietnam, I think about a year and a bit ago, it didn't go unnoticed here, because one way to interpret that particular agreement for a country like Malaysia that also sees itself as a potential semiconductor player higher up the value chain is that in that particular instance, it seemed like Vietnam would be higher up in America's list of friendshoring. Would that be a fair assessment? How should Southeast Asian countries interpret what exactly friendshoring means individually for us in ASEAN?
Well, here's how I would look at it. Friendshoring means allies, friends, and partners get a little bit of favoritism. Now, American companies have been investing in high tech in Malaysia since the 1970s. You know, Intel, Texas Instruments, other companies helped develop the ecosystem that is thriving in Malaysia today. The ecosystem in Vietnam is not as far advanced, but now there's an attempt, I think, by the United States and others to see if there isn't a way to take advantage also of the talent, immense talent, that exists in the country of 100 million, that is Vietnam, and a country of 110 million, that is the Philippines, and a country of 300 million, that is Indonesia. These are all major markets of great interest to American companies, European companies, companies from all over the world. And there's an opportunity now to develop the semiconductor industry, critical minerals industries, because you can find the necessary critical minerals for electric vehicles in Indonesia. In the Philippines, you can get rare earths from Vietnam. The telecommunications industry, which is of great interest and has a national security aspect. So the interest, particularly in the fast-growing countries of Southeast Asia, but also in India, is intense on the part of the corporate world. We are very busy at the US ASEAN Business Council right now because companies want to understand the complexity that is Southeast Asia. And they go to a sister organization to understand the complexity that is India. But they want to find out where are the opportunities among the allies, friends, and partners of this region. We have two allies, Thailand and the Philippines, and Singapore is a place where we have a quasi-alliance. We have very strong partnerships with Vietnam and with Indonesia. Malaysia is certainly considered to be a friendly country and one where our companies have thrived and we've helped develop an ecosystem. So those countries are really at the top of the list for a lot of companies.
Thank you, Mesda. Dr. Alicia Garcia-Herrero, maybe bring in you bringing you in to the same discussion around Southeast Asia. You mentioned just now about how Southeast Asia can be a beneficiary of de-risking, both from the Western side, but also on the China side. How long do you feel this position will be advantageous to countries like Southeast Asia? Just question one. Question two is, most of the countries in ASEAN and Southeast Asia take the position of being not aligned or multi-aligned. Do you see a situation one day where that is no longer tenable and choosing a side or being seen to choose a side becomes a condition to attract the kind of flows that we are now seeing in the last couple of years?
Well, I doubt your flows, you attract flows from China, you attract flows from the West. But those flows don't interact, do they? In other words, you create if there's a company, BYD sets up a company in Southeast Asia, all of the supply chain, all of the value added is coming from China. If a company from the West, which is moving away from China, goes to Southeast Asia, maybe there's Chinese components. But if this company comes straight from the US or Europe, probably there aren't. Why? Because we already have laws which, supply chain resilience. You also have, basically you need to know your end user for many of the supply chains to avoid human rights violations, you name it. So you would just build the supply chain within Southeast Asia, just because that's why you're there. You are trying to hedge against your investment in China if you have it, or you choose Southeast Asia just because you fear this de-risking, and why would you then have components from China? So what I'm trying to say is that what you fear is already happening, is that so far you don't need to choose, because you receive all of these, each of these two supply chains does its bit, and you don't need to care. But the question is, for how long can you do that? Well, maybe for a long time, if what your plans from China either only sell domestically or back to China. Back to China, forget it, because this is not happening. To be very frank, and I'm going to give this data for everybody to hear because it's very important. The largest export market of ASEAN this year, 2024, is the US, not China. It's the US, okay? You can check the data, it's scary. The largest export market of Japan is the US. The largest export market of Taiwan is the US. Used to be China, 40%. South Korea, US. Why? Because China is not importing. It's very simple. Self-reliance is just producing for itself. So the plants from China will produce for Southeast Asia. The plants from Europe and the US might produce for the rest of the world, including US and Europe. So the question is, if push comes to shove, which supply chains will you keep? That's my question to you. Because for the time being, you can do both. But if push comes to shove and you can't, you probably might prefer the market you can export to. So that's the answer to my question.
Thank you, Doctor. Bringing in Sir Martin. Ms. Martin, we spoke briefly just now about the diversity within the EU. I wonder if you could just expand on that a little more and see if you felt there were any countries within the EU that may take one position more than the other, maybe slightly less friendly to de-risking, slightly more friendly to de-risking. Anything of interest there that for us to understand?
Yes, we've just published a big research report on this topic. It's called National Perspectives on De-risking, and it's published by a network of think tanks in Europe. It's called the European Think Tank Network on China, ETNC. And every year we publish a report on a China-related topic, where every country that is a member will write from that country's perspective, and there's also a chapter on EU views. This year, the topic was de-risking and what are the national perspectives. And what we can really see from those 20 plus countries is that you can divide perspectives on de-risking in 4 categories. On the one hand of the spectrum, we have the opponents. And a country like Hungary is a very clear, has a very clear position here, where it's actually against de-risking measures. It's for as much engagement with China as possible, as we've seen with the visit to China recently. The second category is the ones that are cautiously adopting de-risking measures. So they're not necessarily on the forefront, but they're following along a little bit. A country like Austria or Ireland can be put in this category. Portugal as well, for example. A country like Portugal has various reasons to not be as enthusiastic about de-risking. When it comes to China, Portugal really seeks to keep relations with China friendly. So that's one of the reasons for them. Another country like Slovakia might not even be that exposed to China, in their opinion, so then they don't feel the need as much to go for de-risking. The third category is the endorsers or the followers of de-risking policies. Belgium, Finland, Latvia, Poland are countries that you can put in this category. And then we have, of course, at the forefront, the early advocates of de-risking. So that means countries that already adopted policies that can be put under this label of de-risking right at the beginning or before we started using the term 2023. The Netherlands is one of the countries that belongs there, but also Lithuania, Italy, France, Denmark. And these countries that are in this position, for example, have FDI screening mechanisms in place already for many years. Or in the case of the Netherlands, we published a China note in 2019, which was not necessarily a China strategy, but a document outlining how the Netherlands wishes to relate to China, wishes to view China. And the tendency of the document, the one line to summarize it all, was open where possible, but protect where necessary. And that is basically de-risking, but then just in different terms. And if you divide the countries in these 4 categories, you can really see we have a lot of work that we still need to do within the European to get everybody on the same side. The good news is that we have a lot of experience, of course, in managing these types of differences. For the EU, this can be a frustration sometimes. One of the policies that they're pushing for from the EU perspective is, for example, outbound investment screening. And every time you have an ambitious proposal like this, you see the EU wants to do something, but has to water it down a little bit to get all the member states to agree and to join. And it's our job to make sure that it's not watered down too much, to make sure that we actually still have use in the policies that we make. One of the de-risking type policies that we have is the FDI screening regulation of the EU. And the first regulation that we had, the EU noticed that it wasn't pushy enough. It wasn't strong policy enough because it didn't require all of the EU member states to have FDI screening mechanisms. So there are still a few countries like Greece that don't have FDI screening yet. And the EU is now working on making sure that every country has to have a screening mechanism like that to make sure that we protect our industries.
Thank you. It'll be great for us to have a read of that research that you've just published, Ms. Martin. That'll be a good read, I imagine. Also, speaking from a country in ASEAN, I think if the EU is stressed about managing differences, ASEAN would have many, many decades of experience handling the fact that countries, our 10 member states, often find it difficult to agree on a particular strong position one way or another. So can empathize with the EU on that score. Ambassador Osius, Dr. Garcia Herrero mentioned just now, I think the case for why perhaps one day, if Southeast Asian countries have to pick which supply chain to protect or which supply chain to retain, why it might be the one that allows you to export globally. The one angle, though, Ambassador Osius, is as to why the Chinese supply chain, if you can call it that, might be attractive, is maybe not the market access, as Dr. Garcia Herrero mentioned, but the question of international development, the question of investment from China, which one can argue is a little easier to obtain compared to the US and the EU. So that could be one dimension that's worth speaking about. Is there, sitting in DC, do you see any movement from the US about how it views international development as a tool or as an apparatus to persuade countries to get closer to its own orbit?
Well, the reality is that investment flows are way bigger than the resources that can be mobilized, at least by the US government, that's for sure. I'm sitting, actually, the moment I'm sitting in Singapore, and the United States is the #1 investor in Singapore by a long shot. I think China is #4 in terms of investment in Singapore. And when you look at US companies' investment in ASEAN, it's massive. In fact, we have a publication that I want to share, since Xiao Shui shared one. It's called ASEAN Matters for America, America Matters for ASEAN, and it's on our website. US companies invest more in ASEAN than they do in China, plus India, plus Japan, plus South Korea, plus Taiwan combined. We invest massively in the nations of ASEAN. And our companies have been very often present in ASEAN for way over 100 years. One company, was just talking to the Singapore government, has been in this country since before it was Singapore, since it was part of your country, ultimately for 130 years in this spot. Another company has been here for 110 years. So I don't think you're going to see, a sudden flock away from the United States. I worry, however, about things like a bifurcated internet. That would be very damaging to the economies of this region. An out-and-out trade war would be harmful. I think most ASEAN countries would like to be able to trade with the United States, trade with China, trade with the nations of Northeast Asia, and of course with Europe, and not be blocked from any of that. I do worry about the effects of tensions in the region on the free flow of trade and on the continued prosperity of this region. But I don't think you're suddenly going to see an uprooting or a lack of interest in engagement with the United States. We're here. The private sector is going to remain here no matter what.
Thank you, Ambassador. Dr. Garcia Herrero, paint to us a scenario in which the Chinese state and China as a whole doesn't sit idly by as de-risking is happening. Paint to us a scenario where it becomes more assertive and aggressive in its response. How might that look like? And how would that affect supply chains, including in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, well, it's a very good question. So China's upper hand now is clearly on the exports to the rest of the world, meaning Southeast Asian imports, European imports. In the case of the US, increasingly less, because the US has been de-risking for the whole of the Biden administration, no doubt, and at the end of Trump's administration with the trade war, but especially during Biden administration, IRA, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so there you go. Europe is very dependent on Chinese imports, some strategic dependencies, green tech, clearly, pandemic-related issues, ICT, less so for intermediate goods, because Europe exports intermediate goods. So machinery, chemicals, and so on. They might be more expensive, but we don't import too much from China yet. But for Southeast Asia, intermediate goods imported from China are massive. Bear in mind that China's global market share of intermediate goods is 30%. It's much bigger than overall manufactured goods. So for the whole of the emerging world, China is dominant in machinery, in everything that you need to basically become a manufacturer, to run your manufacturing sector. That that is a huge dependence, if you see what I mean. Europe for green tech, but you could argue, well, you use, I don't know, nuclear, not easy for some countries because it takes a long time. You could think of gas beyond Russia, Nigerian gas, you have, but if all of your intermediate goods come from China, or most of them, this is a big problem. It's a huge dependence. So for me, Southeast Asia's challenge, as you rightly point out, is not so much to choose between the best export market, because the choice is clear, because China will not import. Imports have been plummeting since COVID, and it's going to continue because they're substituting imports. The only thing you can sell to China is commodities, basically, which they can't produce, but the rest you're done. So then this is the key. Can you live without those imports? Can you import? This is the case of India today. Can you import from elsewhere? It's too expensive. It's just, but your trade deficit balloons. So that dependence becomes entrenched, to your point. China doesn't even need to retaliate or, take severe actions. You may argue this is what they will do with Europe, but with Southeast Asia, I think the whole idea is you're already so dependent on your intermediate goods that, in my sense of things, China doesn't need to retaliate. So this is the key. Can a country be so dependent on its imports from China? I'm not talking about the market now, its imports from China. And is this something that Southeast Asia needs to start thinking? Again, diversification of sources is the very same thing. So can you do it slowly so that there is no retaliation? I think that's the way to go. And I think basically to make the point that China has been doing this forever. China has never been dependent on a single country for a single good ever in history. So why should others do that?
Great answer. Thank you, Doctor. Ms. Martin, maybe similar question to you, your sense of what China's response will be, not just for Southeast Asia, but for its global positioning.
Yeah, what I see when I engage with the Chinese ambassador in the Netherlands or with Chinese stakeholders in China is really warning against de-risking and in making the assumption that de-risking is the same as decoupling or de-Sinization, when it's of course not the same. So that's an assignment for the EU to explain what we mean with de-risking. Another thing that's often said in the view of official Chinese government or by Chinese academics is that it's a risk in itself to de-risk from China, because engaging with China can prevent risks. Well, of course, the answer to that is yes, exactly. So that's why we're not decoupling, but de-risking. What we see in the reaction of China against de-risking is maybe not necessarily even a reaction, but something that China has been doing for years is economic coercion, and even using the threat of economic coercion. We looked at, we had a research a while ago about types of economic coercion from Russia, China, and the United States against OECD countries. And we looked at the last 10 years to see, okay, what cases can we find that are at least publicly known? And if you look at the cases, half of them are from China and not from the US or from Russia. And the cases of economic coercion for a geopolitical end, many of them are threats. It's not even outright putting a sanction on or an indirect measure like import restrictions or import stop, but just even threatening that there might be countermeasures. And this is something that China can do because we have allowed ourselves to become dependent for so many things on China, for critical raw materials, lithium. Now we have the battle of electric vehicles that's being fought out in the EU, which means that China doesn't even have to say it might react to something. It just has to hint at it. Next to hinting, of course, there have been issues or cases of China actually taking action. And a really interesting one is, of course, the cases of gallium and germanium, where China announced that they would restrict the export of those two materials. Not saying that they would restrict it and not allow it to go out into the world fully, but saying that local governments or companies would have to first get permission to then export it abroad. And as you can imagine, these materials are used pretty widely, from military applications to very broadly used applications, so not necessarily so advanced. But why choose these two materials, gallium and germanium? Of course, it's a warning to gallium and germanium, Germany and France, in showing that China doesn't agree with the direction that the European Union is going in, and these countries are going in, and wants to move against it. And it's our job to make sure that we don't let that deter us in de-risking.
Thank you, Ms. Martin. Ambassador O'Shea, I just want to bring in politics back into our discussion, in particular American politics. If we had this discussion maybe a week ago, I would have started this question with asking, what is Trump's America going to look like vis-a-vis de-risking? Now I think I've got to reframe the question a bit more neutrally. In both cases, in the case where the next president is President Harris, and in the other scenario where it's a return to President Trump, are there key differences do you see in both scenarios with regards to the posture vis-a-vis China and de-risking?
And I'm glad that the outcome remains uncertain. That also means our democracy remains healthy. I think that trade policies with regard to China are basically bipartisan. I think it was Dr. Garcia or Xiaoshui who said, Biden didn't really ease up on kind of hardline policies with regard to China. In fact, there's been a very, very concerted effort to put forward an industrial policy and to make sure that critical communications equipment, critical technologies didn't flow accidentally to China. What we've heard from Trump and from his party is that tariffs would be increased on imports from China, maybe to a very, very high level. I've heard 60% as a possible level of tariffs on China, or even higher. And there I think would be declining imports from China and rising imports from other countries in that scenario. The other thing that could happen under a Trump administration is that some ASEAN nations with high trade surpluses with the United States could become the targets of tariffs or retaliatory measures. And that, I think of Vietnam, Malaysia, and Thailand as at some risk. But there also has been talk about 10% tariffs across the board, which I think could result in a trade war. So I think those of us who believe in free trade find that scenario quite concerning. Harris administration, it's a little too early to tell exactly what her trade policy would be, but I think there would be more continuity with what there's been under the Biden administration. The Biden administration launched the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework and has been pursuing under that a number of initiatives, such as a clean economy, fair economy, supply chain resilience, and then hasn't taken to the final degree a trade agreement that is supposed to be one of the pillars of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. I would imagine negotiations would resume very seriously on the trade pillar of IPEF, and implementation would continue on the clean energy pillar, the fair trade pillar, and supply chain resilience if they're under a Harris administration. And I think there's no way now to predict what will happen, but I can imagine Kamala Harris running with a moderate governor perhaps even from a swing state who's used to negotiating with Republicans. And we could go back to a position that we used to have, which was an affirmative, positive trade agenda, especially with the Indo-Pacific, which is where our future lies. So I'd love to see the return to an affirmative trade agenda, deepening economic engagement with our friends, allies, and partners in the Indo-Pacific, and making sure that the relationship with China remains on an even footing.
Very diplomatic answer, Mr. Ambassador. Maybe last few remarks from the panelists before we open up to questions. I think the organizers have kindly collected good ones for me to put to the panel. But maybe round off this section of this discussion or this forum with something a bit more 30,000 feet, something a bit higher and more general in terms of wrapping up our discussion around de-risking in the context of multipolarity. And maybe I want to go to Dr. Garcia Herrero, your view of whether or how coexistence between two giants, between two great powers, the end of one hegemonic power, and introduction of a world in which you have different poles of influences, where America is no longer the sole hegemon. Do you see coexistence settling to some form of equilibrium in the next 2 or 3 decades? How might that look like? Will we just have to get used to stronger and stronger trade wars and competition? Or do you find a situation where there will be some sort of equilibrium and both the US and China can learn to coexist, understanding that each other has advantages in certain areas and disadvantages in others?
I mean, we had a lot of periods in history of coexistence of empires. I am 100% sure we can coexist. Yeah. But the question really is, what are the conditions? I mean, I would put it this way: what does each of the two major competitors, China and the US, want? I think that's the question. So if the US wants to keep hegemony as it was, that's going to be very difficult because China is already very big. No matter what happens to China in the future, my humble opinion is that China will never reach the US GDP size, frankly, and it's not too difficult to make that calculation because China has started to diverge in nominal terms, in US dollar terms, GDP terms, since 2022, and it's very hard to imagine unless China really changes dramatically with big reforms that nominal GDP growth will be higher than the US, nominal, and this is because of deflationary pressures and so on. But it doesn't really matter. Both will be about the same, very similar, and maybe yes, over time, because of China depopulation, China will be increasingly smaller, but the point is it will remain a huge economy. So coexistence is absolutely necessary. But then the question is, will China accept to be a regional power? I mean, as it looks, not really. China is everywhere. It's in Latin America, it's in, I don't think China is there for the game of regional power. It's there for the game of global power. So that means something different from the US. It's not sharing power. It's actually about ultimate hegemony. It's about changing the world. It's about changing the rules of the game. Now, those who have lived decently with the existing rules of the games in the Second World War, i.e. Europe, Japan, with difficulties after losing the war for some, but, I think they're not ready to see that change. They just don't want that change. Maybe this global South thinks that things will be better with China. So, in a way, what I'm trying to say here is that it's not only about the US and China, it's about everybody's perception of how the world will look like, where China to dominate, where the US to continue to dominate. And that's when I think the frictions become unsurmountable. And coexistence becomes harder because everybody is betting. It's like elections. It's like betting on who will be better for me. And I think it will only be possible to coexist if in a way China were to accept regional hegemony and the US were to give up on that, on Asia's hegemony. Even this is very unlikely. So I would say that we will see coexistence, but it won't be
Comfortable.
peaceful. It won't be fully peaceful. We will see proxy wars here and there, and this is the history of humankind. So we shouldn't be surprised about it. Yeah.
Yeah, we are getting ready for an interesting ride in the coming decades. Ms. Martin, maybe to end on a positive note, end this section on a positive note, do you feel there's a world though where coexistence and cooperation can occur in key areas, one of which is existential questions to humankind like climate emergency? Do you feel there's enough from both sides to push that question of cooperation?
In theory, there is, but in practice, what we see recently is that both China, but also the United States, are using cooperation on global issues like that as chips for bargaining. With, for example, China using cooperation on climate change as something they can give or take away based on how happy they are with the United States' engagement with Taiwan. Where we saw after Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan that China said, okay, then we're not going to engage in the cooperation dialogue on climate change anymore. When, of course, cooperating on this crucial issue is something that should be so clear that it's in the benefit for everybody, and that we should continue the dialogue. We haven't seen the relationship go fully off the rails yet, so that's the positive note. But we have to make sure that every side sees the benefits of cooperating on these issues.
Great. And maybe dialogues like this, forums like this can do our very little bit to promote that point of view alongside the more competitive one. I wanted to bring in some of the questions that have been put forth by the audience. Maybe begin with Ronas, who asks, which ASEAN country is doing the most de-risking according to the US and the EU view? I imagine what Ronas is asking is which ASEAN country is itself becoming a bit more strategic in its supply chain. Any view on that, the three of you?
I would say that quite a number of ASEAN countries are taking steps to diversify. As you know, we've heard from my colleagues on this panel, it's good business to diversify. And so you see, moves by Singapore and Malaysia, for example, to screen investments, similar to the way that Europe and the United States do that. And you see decisions by countries like Vietnam, which maintains a very good, strong relationship with China, to also develop a strong economic relationship with the United States and to benefit from opportunities for upskilling, for increasing Vietnam's involvement in high-tech supply chains. And the United States welcomes that, in fact, is putting money behind it. U.S. universities are involved in that effort. Same goes for Indonesia, where you see innovative U.S. universities like Arizona State contributing to the upskilling of engineers, including those who will be involved in high tech. Same goes for the Philippines. So I think I don't know that I could order how this is happening, but throughout Southeast Asia, it's happening. Countries are acting in their own interest. They realize that we're looking at a multipolar world going forward, and they want to find whatever advantages they can and use their comparative advantages to make their people more prosperous and to move up value chains, make sure that their workforce is better skilled, better educated, more able to innovate, open to flows of information from around the world so that they can prosper in the long term.
Thank you. I've got another one from Celine. How is de-risking affecting EU-China relations and or bilateral relations between EU member states and China? I think either Ms. Martin or Dr. Garcia Herrero, you want to take this?
Yeah, you see it's causing quite some tensions between different EU countries. The disagreements on de-risking, how to relate to China. A related recent event that happened is that Hungary is now the president of the council, but recently went to visit both Russia and China to kind of present themselves as a peacemaker in the relationship, in the war, without the approval of the other EU member states. And the EU reacting quite strongly to that and saying, okay, we really do not agree with this. We forbid any civil servant or any officials to come to meetings in Budapest. So this is one of the ways you can see where the tensions on the different relationships with China really come to the fore. And I think it's important to note that these tensions have always been there. It doesn't mean that de-risking is failing or that it's not happening at all, but it is a risk that we have to manage.
Great. I've got one from Stanley. How much are countries worried about climate change hurting supply chains into the future with increasing weather intensities, destroying infrastructure? So I think a bit of an extension of my last question in terms of how to view de-risking actually in the context of climate change. Any takers?
I can take that quickly. I actually think that climate change related disruptions of supply chains call for diversification. It's quite clear, yeah. You want different routes, you want to have different options. Yes, it's more expensive, but we all know that some critical supply of products is needed in times of difficulty. So in other words, the more we see disruptions in supply chains, the more there will be de-risking. And we shouldn't understand this as China-related de-risking. It's just about risk, whatever that risk is about. It could be climate, it could be China, it could be anything else. So it's just it's just a consequence, and I finish here, of a very naive idea of the world that we economists, I'm an economist, I'm afraid, so I'm part of that bunch of people who thought that, efficiency was everything we should care about, to maximize profit. And we now know that that was the wrong strategy, that sometimes big events can make the whole thing more costly rather than taking care of resilience of supply chains may eventually make things cheaper than just focusing on efficiency. So climate change related issues will make this point loud and clear. And we might even forget about China by then, because it will be so huge and we will all need to find other ways to do things, that simply de-risking will become the norm, totally the norm, for other reasons, indeed, climate change.
Great. One more. Can the speakers react to this comment? The world needs both the US and China, either for promoting mutual dialogue, technology, scientific research, trading, as well as exchanging education purposes. So I guess, yeah, back to our sort of positive kind of harmonizing imperative that at least some people in the audience are looking for. I know we are living in a sort of realist view, and we're all quite clear about where this road leads us. But I suppose if we can go back to our discussion 10 minutes ago around coexistence, if we can push that a bit further. Dr. Garcia, you mentioned a scenario where China stays as a regional power, the US gives up Asia Pacific. Difficult to imagine. But it wasn't so long ago when the US and China were really having consistent dialogue. Now, you can point to different moments and events in the last 20 years where that has reduced or changed, but it wasn't so long ago where that was possible. So if we can do not a counterfactual, but just push a bit more, what is the world in which this changes back to go back to this more dialogical and coexisting sort of equilibrium? Is there a scenario where we can hope for at all?
Well, if we have leaders in both countries who put their how their citizens' welfare at the forefront of their priorities and not hegemony, maybe we get there. But the point is, we need to, we need to think that way. And to be very frank, I come from a country who's not thought of hegemony since, I don't know, like, the 18th century from Spain. So I'm, I just don't think about it. But if I were a US national, to be very frank, and I've been educated to, thinking that the US is the hegemonic power, it's not so easy. It is just not so easy. And I can give you the example of France in Europe. My point is that the closest you've been to hegemony, the harder it is to give it up mentally. So what I'm saying, which seems very obvious, just think about the welfare of your citizens, isn't so obvious if you are there. So what we're asking China and the US to do isn't so easy as it looks or as it seems. Yeah.
Ambassador, you want to say something on that point?
Well, I like the answer, but I also would go back to what we were talking about earlier. Really, the world really does need the United States and China to work together on climate change, on public health and pandemic preparedness, and on tech, on what kind of rules should exist around artificial intelligence and quantum computing and other technologies that we haven't even really come to grips with yet. We need to be able to come together and develop the rules of the road together. It was the United States that invited China into the WTO, and back when I worked for Clinton Gore, and it seemed like a very sensible decision at the time. And I would still argue that it was the right thing to do, because we'd rather have a world where we're coming together and coming up with common rules and then following them together. That's the world that we created after World War II. Why can't we do it again now? And I think it does require wisdom, both in Beijing and in Washington. And we haven't always seen wisdom in either of those and both of those capitals have suffered from a lack of wisdom at different times. So we need to find a way, if we're going to deal with global challenges, to make sure that there's more wisdom and less jingoism in the mix.
Very well put, sir. Ms. Martin, maybe just to extend this a little bit more from the European point of view, as Dr. Garcia-Herrero mentioned, this idea of hegemony isn't as resonant in Europe as maybe it is in the States. I wonder then, does that give an opportunity for the EU to think a bit more flexibly about China and about a day in which there could be more harmony between the EU and China, and less of this adversarial posturing?
Yeah, I like the comment that was made that we do need both the United States and China. To continue on the positive news, the dialogue that I mentioned on climate between the US and China has been restarted again, so it's not all bad news on that side. On the question of the EU and its position between the United States and China, we do have different priorities and different views than both the United States and China. Of course, we're more closely aligned with the United States. But we have to make it clear that we are not the same as the United States. When I talk to Chinese counterparts, often researchers or from the government, we're really put in the same category as in, oh, the United States wants to go this direction, so I'm sure that the EU wants to go that direction as well. Or the other way around, the EU has done X, Y, Z, it must be the Americans that are behind it, instead of that there is actually a European interest in de-risking, if we take the example of de-risking. And it's the role of the European Union to make sure that we can still manage these tensions between the two countries. And we can also play a role in Southeast Asia and ASEAN in providing an alternative to these two poles of hegemons between the United States, between China, to make sure that there's a different presence there as well, economically, but also diplomatically and politically. One of the ways that the Netherlands, for example, has really shown its commitment to the Indo-Pacific is, well, first to publish a document, a policy document to say, okay, we want to engage more with the Indo-Pacific. That's the easy part, of course. But one of the very concrete things that came out of that is that the Netherlands committed to sending a ship to the Indo-Pacific every 2 years to dock at several ASEAN countries and cooperate and really show, okay, we're not just here in words, but we're here also in physical presence with the military. Next to the military side, of course, there's also the wish for more engagement with Indo-Pacific, which I can only support.
And can I respond? I really, that's a really interesting way of looking at things, because it's highly unlikely that you know, the United States would say to the Europeans, jump, and the Europeans would say, how high? That just doesn't happen in today's world, and vice versa. It doesn't happen. And there was a time, I think, when the United States operated on the basis of, well, we're the big ally and we'll give instructions to a smaller ally, wherever it is in the world. That era ended a long time ago. It's been, for decades, the United States has been learning how to be a partner, how to be a good partner. And I would cite Indonesia and India as two examples. Indonesia and India aren't likely to become US allies. They're not going to take instructions from the United States. It's just not going to happen. But we have learned to respect one another. The United States, I think, has learned, and I'm not a diplomat anymore, so I don't work for the US government. I can say whatever I want. But I have seen growth on the part of my country in terms of understanding of how to be a good partner, how to listen to Delhi, or listen to Jakarta, or listen to Brasilia, or other major countries where they're not going to agree with us, but we'll find areas of commonality. And I think we've got to keep going in that direction, where in a multipolar world, where the United States continues to learn to be a good partner.
Very well put, Mr. Ambassador. Not quite sure every American I meet has that same awareness as you just articulated, but hopefully that's true. Maybe just to close off while I wait for other questions, if there are any, around soft power, and maybe a view from each one of you. It would seem to me, if I was looking at it dispassionately, one of the key advantages that the West still has, and it may be eroding these days, but still has perhaps, is a sense of kind of cultural soft power over much of the world, which China hasn't yet achieved. Do you find that trend is changing, in the sense that is China becoming a bit more attractive in those softer aspects than the West has been?
I think that's another really interesting question. I don't know that I have a complete answer, but I would note that when it comes to, say, cinema, okay, Hollywood's still big, but so is Bollywood. I mean, there's really interesting cinema coming from all over the world, and the United States has been following Korean film with great intensity. K-pop is big in the United States, so not all music, not all soft power is expected to come from the United States. The fact is, we can embrace the cultures of others. I actually think that is one of the things that makes America great, because we come from everywhere. And so there's the opportunity for people whose origins are somewhere else to share their culture in the United States, and for that to be celebrated. The United States has long looked to Europe in many ways for cultural leadership when it comes to music, when it comes to educational forms. Our universities were created in the model of both British and German universities. So these are powerful forces, and they're not one way. And now that the internet connects us all so quickly, the flow of information is very fast, and it goes in every direction.
Any thoughts from our European panelists?
Yeah, when I hear the word soft power, I immediately have to think about China's panda diplomacy, because the Netherlands is one of the countries that has pandas, and actually recently had a new panda baby, which is of course unveiled with a lot of pomp and circumstance. And then what's going to be the name of the baby? We're going to reveal it after 100 years, 100 days, sorry. So that's one of the ways in which China does use soft power in the Netherlands. But what we see specifically in the Netherlands, at least, is that it is undercut by all the negative news that's coming from China, such as human rights repressions or journalists that have increasingly difficult time doing their work in China itself. That's really undercutting the positive message that the Chinese government is trying to spread. It makes it more difficult as well, as somebody who is from an Asian heritage as well. What I really noticed in Corona times is that Asianness is then linked to this negative perspective on Corona and on the Chinese government. So for us researchers, it's always important to say we have the Chinese government. It's separate from Chinese people or Chinese companies or local governments. They all have different interests, different perspectives, and it's important to not just put it on the same pile. Overall, we do see that soft power of China in the Netherlands is decreasing. We have public opinion surveys that every year look at how Dutch people see foreign policy in general. So also, for example, the United States, Russia, and also some questions on China. And we see throughout the years that the positive sentiments towards China are really decreasing. For example, we had a question of how many, or do you think that China can bring economic benefits in the Netherlands? Which of course they can, but the amount of people that answer yes to that question is decreasing year by year. So that's really a long way to go still for Chinese soft power.
Don't forget ping pong. That used to be one of the forms. Before panda diplomacy, there was ping pong diplomacy, and it was really effective.
Yeah, vaguely remember that. That's yeah, many interesting ways that geopolitics plays out in the real world. Just as a counterpoint to this point of soft power that I brought up, I don't know if any of you have seen the survey, I think a few months ago, of ASEAN countries. And it paints a different picture than what Ms. Martin said about the Netherlands. It seems that there's a shift kind of away from the US and a bit closer to China. My personal view is that it has a lot to do with Gaza and how a lot of the countries in this region are not pleased with the American and the Western response. I wonder if you think it goes beyond that and there's something about Southeast Asia and the global South's view that maybe it's time to get closer to China as well. And I wonder if that computes into your risk thinking vis-a-vis de-risking.
I think that you put your finger on it. A huge Indonesian population, large Malaysian population isn't happy with what's happening in the Middle East and isn't happy with America's role. And so I think that had a big impact on the survey that you're citing. Underneath, if you look beyond the kind of numbers that might be influenced by what's happening in Gaza, I don't think the overall attitudes have changed all that dramatically. The views of the United States are mostly still that we're in Southeast Asia to stay. Companies are here to stay. We're committed to Southeast Asian prosperity. And for 75 years, we've been committed to peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific. And I think for the most part, with the Gaza exception, those views of a friendly United States that's a Pacific power still remain.
Any thoughts on the same question, Dr. Garcia Herrero and Ms. Martin?
I just want to add that I think you're referring to ISS survey.
ISIS, yeah.
Yes. So the Philippines stands out as the one and only where the US is, and then Vietnam, and then all of the others, as you said, clearly tilt towards China. So it sounds like very clearly to me a Gaza-related thing. Also because in previous surveys, actually, if I recall correctly, it was the other way around. China was losing acceptance. I think overall, if you look at other services, existing services, we have our own research with big data on, it's actually about Belt and Road in particular, but we look at the image of China and the Belt and Road Initiative across the globe. And interestingly, up to 2021, the image of China globally was worsening, in some cases worse than others, Europe and the US, of course. But interestingly, since then, especially 2022, so it's not only Gaza, it might even be Ukraine, the image of China has kind of taken two different routes. The emerging world has improved the image of China since mid-2022, and the developed world has worsened the image of China. So I think two things are happening, Ukraine and the West, and especially Europe. I think Ukraine is extremely important to understand what's happening with China's image in Europe. And second, Gaza on, in opposite direction, the whole global South, to some extent Ukraine, because I think if you recall G20 in Indonesia, I mean, this idea that the communique has to suffer because of Ukraine, I mean, this idea that, everybody else is in a way suffering because because of this situation is clearly has been a little bit heavy on the global South. So Ukraine and 5 times more Gaza has clearly created these results that you referred to, this gap. But in the West, for sure, I can only tell you in Europe, I think the direction is exactly what Xiaoxue mentioned. It's increasingly negative.
And that G20 happened at the G20 was really interesting because Indonesia took an extraordinary leadership position. President Jokowi went to Zelensky before he went to Putin, invited them both, and he kept the G20 alive. So it was an instance of multipolarity working for the benefit of the globe, and Indonesia was in the lead.
Great. No, that's really helpful in framing this discussion. We're in our final couple of minutes. I wonder if I can invite each and every one of you to maybe just give a few seconds closing remarks on the topic, what your hopes for the future are. Maybe begin with Ms. Martin.
Yeah, hopes for the future is to continue the path of de-risking and make sure we're not deterred by any worries about a counter reaction by China. The other thing to maybe close off with is that we still see that we're not really aware of the costs of de-risking as much in the European public. Speaking specifically about Dutch people, in the opinion surveys that we did, we saw a lot of people were very positive about the impact of reducing unwanted dependencies, where it was listed even, I think, as the 6th most positive, impactful development in the future that could happen. But then when we were asked about the negative side of, do you think that there might be some negative impacts to prosperity due to reducing economic ties with China? Only, I think, 36% believe that this would happen. And the impact of this development was also rated very low at number 50, when I think it would actually have quite a big impact, important impacts. So this is something for the governments to educate their populations and to also warn them that, okay, if we want to be more strategically autonomous, if we want to de-risk, if we want to be less dependent, that also means that prosperity might be affected, even just a little bit.
Transparency on the costs of de-risking. Very good note to end on, Ms. Martin. Dr. Garcia Herrero? Yeah, you're on mute.
Sorry. Well, not much to add. I mean, I would say that, yes, de-risking shouldn't be seen as a protectionist measure against China. It's a broader concept, and it can be applied across the board. And frankly, even for Southeast Asia, because in some cases, you might be too dependent, maybe not on China, maybe on the US, maybe on a specific provider, maybe on, we just need to accept that this concept is not evil. Sometimes I feel like, listening quite frankly to, as Xiaoxue said, some of Chinese ambassadors in Europe, it looks like, wow, let's treat this more, with a little bit more of a respect to the concept itself. It's about diversifying, reducing risk. It should be positive in essence. So I think I would try to mitigate the political understanding of this concept and try to put it very simply, very rationally, very, very naturally. I think that's where we should be going.
Reframing the narrative around de-risking to be less adversarial and more sort of natural and sensible economically. Ambassador Osius, last words from you.
Well, first, I've learned a lot from Ms. Martin and Dr. Garcia, and I've enjoyed this. I think the de-risking will continue. I think for the reasons that you've just heard. But as an American, at least after the 100 days silly season that we're now in, I am hoping, because you asked what are our hopes, I am hoping for a positive, proactive trade agenda, because I think that's what the people in this part of the world want and the Indo-Pacific want. I think that's what our friends in Europe want. I think that's what our friends in other parts of the world want. And so I'd like to see the United States return to the field with a positive, proactive trade agenda.
Very, very good. Thank you so much to all the three panelists. This has been a pleasure. Thank you, FPCI, and I'll return the mic to Lian and her colleagues at FPCI. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Shahrial, for moderating the discussions. And also thank you to Ambassador Osius, Dr. Alicia, and Xia Sui for sharing your incredible insights. Before we wrap up the event, I would like to invite all the participants to take a short photo session. So please turn on your camera and have your brightest smile ready. Okay, on my count, 1, 2, 3. Another one, 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you, everyone. It has been a fruitful discussion, and I'm sure the participants found this sessions interesting and highly informative. Today's event will be available for rewatch on FPCI's official YouTube channel at Secretariat FPCI. And additionally, you will see a link in the chat box for everyone to fill in and claim the e-certificates. Please make sure to fill in the details correctly, as the e-certificates will be sent to your email. And lastly, stay tuned at our social media at Global Town Hall and FPC Indo to get informed on our recent program and events. See you at the next FPCI event and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.
Bye-bye.